Or not grass?
Yeah, it's from, it can come from a variety of different kinds of plants, but the grass pollen is, yeah, it's coming, blown in the wind from
So it
grass
is.
plants, yeah. All right, so I just want to remind you about what I'm going to be looking for in terms of my grading expectations for these last couple of weeks. You have two options. Either is fine with me. Option one, which I think would be easier for you and probably more fun as well, is I am happy to grade you based on the evidence that I have from you in class that you are engaged and trying to learn stuff. And this is going to work really well for those of you who have the ability to focus for these next 10 days. If you are, especially if you are interested in the work that we're doing, which for today is going to be about these adaptations that we started yesterday. And for those of you who make choices in class to allow you to stay as productive as possible. If that's challenging for you, for any reason, then I will also be happy to evaluate your work for concrete evidence of your understanding. And the problem with that is, if I don't see you doing anything in here, then what you turn in is a lot less meaningful to me. I see the work and I can evaluate whether it's correct, but what I don't know is to what degree does it represent your own understanding or not. So just be aware that if you choose to go the second route, that may involve conversations with me where I try to figure out, okay, well, how much of this do you actually know versus how much of it did you document that's correct but you don't understand. If you do the work here in class, I got you covered. I can give you full credit simply by making those kinds of observations in the classroom. And if you want to talk that over with me outside of class, I'm happy to do it. For today, we've got a couple things that I want to talk about. The big piece is this connection between adaptations and evolution. And as part of that, I want to clarify, this will take less time and it's more intuitive. I want to clarify what an adaptation actually is. So yesterday, I gave you a quick definition and I told you, get started like doing some research, finding out some information. But I also know that some of you were like, well, but I don't really get what an adaptation is. So that's the first piece we're going to go over. And then we'll talk about how adaptations and evolution work hand in hand. We're going to discuss really briefly kind of a must-know in biology, which is the Galapagos finches. Some people call them Darwin's finches. They're a really important organism that is the kind of thing that for biological competency is sort of required. And then you'll move to working on your adaptation. And in particular, what I'm going to ask you to think about today is, how did that adaptation arise through natural selection? And I have an example that I will walk you through so you'll see what I'm looking for there. So you don't need to write this down. This is just a quick review because this underlies much of the work you're going to be doing today. Natural selection, which we talked about last week. This has to do with the idea that organisms that have alleles, genetic stuff that makes them more likely to survive and reproduce, are more likely to pass those alleles along to their offspring, which will make those alleles more abundant in future generations. And this is something that when we think about single-celled organisms like bacteria, it's way easier to picture. Because if you have a population of bacteria living in a pond, and one of those bacteria develops a mutation that allows it to, say, detect the presence of toxins in certain concentrations, then it's really easy to see a couple of things. One is that bacteria now has a survival advantage. If it's in an area where there are toxins present, and those toxins are detected by the bacteria, then those toxins might trigger the bacteria to move to another area, which would be great for that bacteria because then it's not exposed to the toxins. At that point, the bacteria might reproduce. If it reproduces the way bacteria reproduce, single-celled organisms with one chromosome, they just split in half. It's called binary fission, and it's basically like mitosis. And when that happens, the daughter cells will have the exact same alleles that the parent organism had. So it's real easy to see how you go from one organism having a beneficial allele to 2, and then 4, and then 8, and then 16, and 32, and 64, and 128, 256, 512, and it just keeps going and going and going. It's a little trickier with diploid organisms that reproduce sexually. And the reason for that is because those organisms, when they reproduce, only give one of the 2 alleles that they have to their offspring. So if there's an organism that has a really great beneficial allele, like if a human had an allele, this is not physically possible, but just a thought experiment. If a human was born with a mutation that allowed that individual to jump like 5 times higher than any other human beings, that would be a pretty cool adaptation, right? And that person might have kids. But if that person was heterozygous for that trait, the super high jumping trait, they had one allele that gave them the ability to jump really high and one allele that was normal. They couldn't jump that high. Then just by chance, their children might inherit the normal allele. And if that person has 3 kids, it's not impossible, it's not even that unlikely that all 3 would inherit the normal allele. And if that's all the children that that individual has, then that allele disappears. It's gone. When that person dies, that allele is gone. And although it was beneficial and maybe helped them survive, maybe even helped them reproduce, it did not increase in abundance in future generations. So it's a little trickier with diploid organisms because we have to think about it statistically. It's not that a beneficial allele will result in increased survival and reproduction, and then that allele will be more abundant. It's that it's more likely. And so if there are 100 mutations that result in favorable alleles, maybe only 50 of them end up becoming more abundant down the road. But it's still, statistically speaking, more likely to happen for a beneficial allele than for a neutral allele, and way more likely than for an unfavorable allele. So we think about it in terms of statistics when we look at diploid organisms, and we're not going to get into the details of that, but I wanted to just have you thinking about that in the back of your head. So basically, in order for natural selection to occur, we need 2 things. One is we need a variety of different alleles, because one allele can't be more favorable than another if they're the same. So there has to be differences. Those differences can be pre-existing in a population, or those differences can arise through mutations. And then the next thing that has to happen for natural selection is that we have to have what we call selection pressure. That's the environmental piece. That's the external stuff that makes an allele more favorable, and that can change. So there is, to a certain degree, some back and forth that can happen with natural selection. As the environment changes, we can have organisms change as one allele becomes more abundant, and then they can change in a different way if the environment kind of flips back and maybe a different allele becomes more abundant. That can certainly happen. If the environment changes permanently, continues changing, but it doesn't ever cycle back to the way it was before, then we're more likely to get what we call directional evolution. So natural selection is not going to kind of cycle organisms sort of back and forth between different phenotypes, but instead there's going to be new phenotypes and new phenotypes and new phenotypes as new and improved alleles arise that are more favorable to the new environment. And that's where we can start seeing what we call adaptations, right? So an adaptation, as I mentioned yesterday, is a heritable behavior or physical trait that improves biological fitness. And the thing about this is, you could sort of argue, well, doesn't every allele, like the beneficial allele, do that? And the answer is, well, yes. But also, when we talk about adaptations, we're talking about obvious things, and it may be controlled by more than one allele. Even if it is a single allele, it's usually something that is somewhat dramatic, an identifiable feature. So, like blood type, for example, might not be something that we would consider to be an adaptation. It's certainly hereditary, it's certainly favorable on balance for people to have different blood types, but it's not something that would be like, ooh, that's an adaptation. Our opposable thumb, on the other hand, we would look at that and say, that is an adaptation. And here's how I like to think about it. An adaptation is an obvious, visible solution to a clear problem. And I'm putting solution and problem in quotation marks because, of course, like, the environment isn't a problem, and our physical traits aren't necessarily solutions, but we can sort of think about them that way. So in that sense, it's pretty easy to think about our opposable thumb as being a, quote, solution to a, quote, problem. The problem is it's awfully hard to manipulate things when all of your fingers work in the same direction. The solution is organisms that happen to have at least one digit that works in a different direction have much more ability to manipulate things. I can grab my keys and I grab them between my fingers and my thumb. Most people don't hold their keys between their fingers like this. It's not as effective. So this happens because of natural selection. And we're going to get into this in a little bit more detail because that's where it gets really kind of fascinating. Looking at these adaptations is cool and it's fun. Thinking about how did they arise, that's where it gets really kind of fascinating. And I wanted to just go through a couple of examples of things that are pretty clear adaptations so that you kind of have an idea. And I think most of you found some good stuff yesterday, but just in case. So one example is the camouflage fur that some organisms have, some mammals have. And obviously, like, insects can be camouflaged and birds can be camouflaged too. But with mammals, it's pretty easy to think of, like, well, what's the problem and how is this a solution? If you're a tiger, it's sort of a problem if your prey can see you easily. If it's really easy to visually spot your predator, then you'll see it from a far enough distance away that you can avoid it. So the solution is have fur that blends in with the background. That makes a lot of sense. Now, it's not like the tiger was walking around and it didn't blend in with the background and then it suddenly thought, you know what would help? And then it, like, evolved. That's not how it happens. It happens through natural selection. So the question is, how do we get from here, to here, and where did we start from? What did tigers or their ancestors look like prior to having this camouflage? So that's going to be part of your work today. Another example, and this one is fun because it's so common. You've heard about giraffes and their necks all throughout your science classes, right? And the explanation here is always, well, if you have a longer neck, then you can eat leaves that are higher up on the trees. And that gives you more food, and that's a good thing. And that's true. But I read the other day, and the reason that I wanted to bring this up is a lot of times these things are more complex than we think. And it turns out that giraffe necks, people now think that the food availability had something to do with it, but a lot of people think that maybe also fighting had something to do with it too. Did you find that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's really cool, right? Like I wouldn't have known that, but apparently, so you all know, like, headbutting among animals is kind of a thing. Like, that's how they, like, decide who's, like, more metal, right? And so they're, like, constantly bashing skulls. Well, it turns out that it's very likely that the original evolution of, like, some of the attributes of the giraffe's neck came because it improved their ability to headbutt other giraffes. And then once some of those attributes developed, like a little bit of extra flexibility and some extra musculature to make them stronger, then those that were able to reach higher food sources had an additional advantage. So it was kind of two things that were both putting pressure to cause the giraffes' necks to grow longer. And now it's really like, it's no longer such an advantage for fighting. Like the headbutting thing is not, it's not so helpful to have a really long neck. So at some point it sort of shifted to food sources. And that happens, those kinds of things happen all the time with evolution. Another example that we did look at before was toxins, like in the rough-skinned newts. And we have newts around here. They're common in creeks and ponds around Corvallis. And they clearly, like, there's a problem. The problem is, I don't want to get eaten. The solution is, let's be toxic. But again, this is not something where, you know, a newt was like, I know, I can't believe nobody thought of this before. I'm just going to start producing toxins. It developed through natural selection from organisms that did not secrete toxins. Now, salamanders as a group, they do secrete stuff. They're slimy. So they have glands on their skin, and stuff comes out of the glands. But for the most part, amphibians do not secrete toxins, not the way that, or salamanders don't secrete toxins the way that newts do. So something changed, and natural selection was able to act on that change. It was a genetic change, and those alleles became more common, and that started this process of developing this unique adaptation that the newts have. What I'm gonna, one thing that I want to bring up really quickly, and this is kind of, like I said, this is sort of evolution 101 in a lot of places. If you've never heard of the Galapagos finches or Darwin's finches, then you need to hear it. All right, so I'm going to go through this because it's so important for our sort of like the historical background. But we're not going to focus on Darwin's finches in this class. So basically, there's a group of birds that live on some islands off the coast of South America, the Galapagos Islands. And those islands are relatively close to the mainland. They're not super far away. And the islands are relatively close to each other. And it's like was noticed like far before Darwin came along that not only did these finches seem to resemble each other in a lot of ways, but they also seem to resemble a finch that lived on the mainland. And so, like, for a very long time, people sort of thought, well, these birds are related, but they didn't really know what that meant. And what Darwin came up with when he saw these birds for the first time when he was traveling in the 1850s was, oh, you know what? Here's something that could explain this. What if the original ancestor to all of these different finches was the one that lived on the mainland? Maybe a breeding pair like flew over to the islands, or several breeding pairs, or maybe they got like caught in the wind and they blew over, or they were like on floating debris on the ocean and they floated over. It's not impossible for that to happen. In fact, it's quite likely for that to happen. Lots of things got to those islands from the mainland. If that happens, then the finches that are now on the islands have a different environment than the finches that were living on the mainland. On the mainland, it was mostly finches that lived on the ground and ate seeds. But on the islands, there were a bunch of different food sources. And the birds that live on the islands show adaptations, particularly in terms of the size and shape of their beak, that are clearly solutions to the problems that arise from various kinds of food. So for example, the finches that eat fruits and seeds that have maybe thick rinds or require a lot of force to get into, have these thick, like short beaks. So they're really adapted well for like crushing hard shells or getting through the rinds of fruit. Birds that are more likely to eat insects have smaller beaks that are generally longer and thinner. So they're more adapted to like extracting insects from holes in the ground or from holes in like plant material, like plant bark or plant stems. And so what Darwin surmised is that, well, we can kind of figure out how these birds might be related. And then he came up with the idea of natural selection, and simultaneously with another man, Wallace. And at the time, they really only had what these organisms looked like to work from. Now we have a bunch of other tools. Like we can do a genetic analysis where we sequence DNA and look at similarity of DNA. We can do like computer-aided analysis where we like take different bird beaks and figure out, oh, well, this is how they, most likely how they sort of were transformed over time. We can look at embryos and watch embryonic development of birds and see, oh, well, here's some similarities, here's where there are some differences, and then over time we can see those differences amplify in embryonic birds. But Darwin was just looking at them and he kind of put them together. So one of the things that's really cool about adaptations is that they provide a visual link to natural selection. Natural selection acts at the level of alleles. It's at a genetic level. It works on populations, not individuals. It takes a really long time. We don't tend to see really obvious natural selection very often, but adaptations are super easy to recognize. We can see them. That's what makes them adaptations, is that they're obvious solutions to environmental problems. So because of that, the real utility for scientists in thinking about adaptations is that they allow us to really clearly think about natural selection. If I wanted to talk to you about natural selection and how that influenced blood type, that would be awfully difficult. It's really hard for me to tell you, oh, well, if you have blood type A positive, then you're more likely to survive and reproduce, and B negative is, I wouldn't even know where to begin, how to explain to you how blood type or earlobes, how does that influence human survival and reproduction? I have no idea. I cannot be the one to stand in front of you and say, well, obviously earlobes help people survive, and so if you have earlobes, then you're gonna have more kids. Like, what? That doesn't even make any sense. But opposable thumbs, that one's an easy one. If you think about organisms with opposable thumbs, you can imagine all sorts of problems that would be solved by the development of that heritable genetic trait. And as an aside, we're not going to talk about this in detail, but as an aside, one of the things that's kind of interesting to think about is when we think about how adaptations can arise, we can think about them in a couple of ways. One way is to think about how the beak size and shape of Darwin's finches might have changed. In that case, there was probably some sort of existing variation in beak size and shape, and natural selected acted on that existing beak size and shape to kind of like move things to the extremes. And we're not going to get into the details of the mechanics of that, but evolutionary biologists have figured out how that can happen. It's not too difficult to lay out. Other things are more of an instant change. So for example, there is a gene in fruit flies called Antenopedia. And Antenopedia is a gene that if there's a mutation in that gene, flies will grow legs out of their heads instead of antennae. What? And it's not like, I know, it's not like, a mutation to that gene causes the antenna to look a little bit different, and then over 10,000 years they start to look more and more and more like legs, and then pretty soon you've got like little legs. It is instant. The flip of the switch, one generation. That's what happens when you have what are called regulatory genes. Genes that turn other genes on or off. And what happens is that there can be mutations in DNA that's not being used. So all sorts of crazy stuff can happen to DNA that's not being used. And then one of these regulatory genes can experience a mutation, and all of a sudden, what was unused DNA can be activated. or certain sets of genes could be turned on and off when they aren't supposed to be. So, and so we can get big changes. It is possible, for example, that the development of the opposable thumb involved just a few mutations. It is possible that the first organism with an opposable thumb was like born with an opposable thumb from nothing, because it might have been one of those regulatory genes and a mutation in that regulatory gene. So we don't always have to look for the gradual transition, but usually we can tell the story with a gradual transition. So I'm going to give you an example right now, and you don't have to write this down, but I think this will be helpful because this is what I'm going to ask you to do today with your adaptations poster. So if we were to look at any particular adaptation, one of the things that we might want to ask ourselves was, well, what was it before, right? Like, what was the characteristic or behavior prior to being whatever we see now? So with giraffes, we can imagine, well, the prior condition would have been a much shorter neck. Like, we can imagine the ancestor of giraffes maybe looked more like a horse, right, with a much shorter neck. With the tiger, it might have been an animal that did not have camouflage coloration. Maybe it was just brown or kind of yellowish or something. With newts, it would have been a salamander that secreted stuff, right, like slimy skin and all that, but it wasn't toxic secretions. So one of the things that I want you to think about is, prior to the development of the adaptation, the evolutionary history of an organism, what did it look like? What did that structure or behavior look like? You may be able to find this for your particular adaptation. You may be able to see, oh, well, prior to the development of this adaptation, this is what the organisms looked like, all right? And then the next thing to think about is, do we see transitional states or fossils? And those might be in existing organisms, or it might be in the fossil record. And this can give us clues to how quickly those adaptations occurred. So with Darwin's finches, it's pretty easy to see those transitional structures. We see the original ground finch, which still survives, and then we see all the different related ground finch populations that live on the islands. And it's really easy to look at them and kind of be like, oh, well, this one is closer to this, and this one is closer to this, and we can kind of build that family tree. With some things, it's a little bit more difficult to see those transitional stages. We may not see them in existing organisms, and there may not be a fossil record or evidence that shows like transitional changes. Maybe because whatever it is that we're looking at doesn't fossilize, like tiger fur, or maybe because it is something that happened really, really quickly, like potentially something like an opposable thumb or leg antenna. The next thing that I want you to think about is, how did natural selection play a role in the development of the adaptation? And this part, for most of the adaptations that you're likely to be looking at, almost certainly this information is out there. Almost certainly somebody has answered the question of how natural selection acted to develop some of these things, but you may not find it today. I did a bunch of research on a bunch of different adaptations, and I didn't find it for all of them. For some of them, it's sort of unspoken and obvious, like newt toxin. For others, it's not necessarily obvious, and maybe somebody knows, but it's not the kind of person who's gonna like put the information out where Google can see it really easily. So that it might be in a scientific journal somewhere, or there might be an expert somewhere that can say, oh, well, here is exactly how this particular adaptation evolved, but that isn't something that is accessible by us in this classroom with Chromebooks using a Google search. And then the last thing that I want you to think about, and again, this is something that definitely is out there. This information is known. You might not be able to find it easily, but I think most of you will be able to find something. What is the point at which we start to see this adaptation? So which organism or group of organisms had it, and which of the ancestors didn't have it. So we're going to try to sort of pinpoint where this adaptation arose in time. And I'm going to give you an example. And the example that I'm going to give you is for taste buds, because I thought that was kind of an interesting thing to think about. And so I looked it up, and it turns out that prior to the development of the adaptation, we know that all sorts of cells have what are called chemoreceptors, and I'll talk about that in a second. And then we see all sorts of transitional structures in existing organisms. I'll talk about that. We can think about how natural selection might have promoted the development of taste buds, and we know the family tree of taste buds. So we know how this, which is a bundle of chemoreceptors in bacterial cells, became this. And I'm going to walk you through that right now, not because it's something you need to know, but because I want you to see an example. All right? So here's how the story goes. With taste buds, their evolutionary origin is these things called chemoreceptors. Everything has chemoreceptors. Bacteria, single-celled organisms, the simplest, most primitive single-celled organisms on the planet have chemoreceptors. Those chemoreceptors basically take the external environment and allow it to interact with the internal environment of the cell. For example, if there's a sugar molecule floating in a pond and it hits the chemoreceptor of a bacteria, that causes the chemoreceptor to release chemical substances inside. Better move that. Sorry. It causes chemical substances to be released inside the cell, and then those chemical substances can interact with other cellular structures. Like, for example, some bacteria have what's called a flagellum, which is like a tail that propels them. And so this whole system evolved in such a way that when a good chemical is sensed, then the flagellum moves in such a way as to propel the bacterium toward that good thing. And they also have antagonists, or things that aren't good. They have repellents. Those are substances that when the chemoreceptor receives them, the signal they send to the flagellum is go the other way, right? Like, let's move in the opposite direction. And one of the things that's kind of cool about this is that, like, my question is, well, how in the world did this evolve? And that's a great question, but this was our starting point for taste buds. We could look at what was our starting point for chemoreceptors. Like, we can look at all of these things. So we know that chemoreceptors in bacteria can detect sugar. And then we know, so looking at like transitional forms, we know there's all sorts of organisms that are multicellular that also have chemoreceptors. Fish, for example, have chemoreceptors. They have chemoreceptors in their mouths, and they have chemoreceptors all over their bodies in some cases. So same deal, they can detect chemicals, they can detect chemical signatures. Now they have some of these receptors in their mouths. And in this case, the transmission is not happening solely within the cell, right? Now what's happening is the cell receives an external signal from the environment, and then that cell communicates with other cells in a multicellular organism to influence, for example, behavior. And so we can imagine, and this is where we're thinking about natural selection, we can imagine that if some of these chemoreceptor cells experienced a mutation that made them, say, more sensitive, then they would be able to detect lower levels of these beneficial food particles. Those organisms would probably get more food. There's more likelihood that they would pass those alleles on to future generations. We can imagine natural selection working to increase the abundance of organisms that had those extra sensitive receptor cells. We can also imagine, well, what about just the mouth? Like, what if the chemoreceptors in these organisms' mouths experienced a mutation that allowed them, say, to differentiate between different kinds of food? So not just detecting sugar now, but detecting sugar, detecting fat, detecting salt, maybe even detecting like like toxic chemicals. In fact, bitterness, that taste of bitterness, is a relatively recent trait that arose in organisms, and we think that it had a lot to do with detecting toxins. Many toxins taste bitter. So that is like, organisms developed that through natural selection. And then I mentioned that we can look at a family tree and kind of figure out where this happens, and we figured it out. With animals, taste buds first showed up at the point at which jaws evolved. So prior to that development, most animal organisms were aquatic, and they were all aquatic, and they had no jaws, and so they lived in the sea, and they didn't really have taste buds. And then we see, right about the same time that jaws evolved, taste buds evolved. And that kind of makes sense, actually, because if you, like, jaws are like an eating thing, and so it's like an eating specialty, and it makes sense that eating specialties would evolve in concert with each other. And interestingly enough, by the way, we're jawed fish, technically. And we're also what they call bony fish, technically. We're like members of all these old groups of organisms because we're very closely related. So the osteichthyon is a word that means the bony fish. We're osteichthyons. We are bony fish. We are like, we evolved from the same lineage as like trout. So it's kind of fun to think about stuff like that. So this is just an example of what I'm looking for. It's got sort of responses to all those prompts that I mentioned earlier. It tells an evolutionary story about an adaptation, not about a new species, but just about a particular adaptation within a group. So what I'm going to ask you to do now is take that challenge on. Yesterday, I gave you time to figure out what adaptation you wanted to look at, talk about it sort of in general sense, like how is it useful to the organism. Think about things like, well, how do other organisms tackle this same problem? Like, without that adaptation, are there any other options? Today, I want you to go through the evolutionary origins of your particular adaptation. And I'm going to put these questions back up here so that you can think about them as you do your work. And I'm going to give you the rest of the period to do this. And remember what I'm looking for. My expectation is those of you who want full credit based on the work that you do in class are going to show me that you are trying to learn in here. You're going to show me that you're not just worried about, well, I got it done, I'm going to turn it in. That's not showing me that you're trying to learn. That's showing me that you're trying to get some points by completing an assignment. If you want to approach it that way, that's fine. But then what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at your assignment and I'm going to say, does this show mastery of all this stuff? And I'm going to assess it in a different way. Rather, give you all full credit based on the work that I see you do in class, because I think it'll be better for you, right? Okay, I'm going to stop the recording and then we'll see if there's any questions.